Welcome to Session 6, External Selection. Making final decisions is difficult, particularly complex decisions. And I believe we make those difficult and complex decisions too frivolously. At times we actually say, I think this will work out fine. I hope this works out okay. Have you heard yourself saying this? I certainly have said it on occasion myself. Often it does work out, and when it doesn't, often it bears minor consequences. But things like where we live and who we marry and having children and choosing a career field or choosing an education field, etc., are life-changing and critical decisions. There's no place for frivolity in such decisions. What happens is after 4 years of college and obtaining a degree, you find you don't like the chosen career field, or your chosen career field will not support your chosen lifestyle. No problem. You've only wasted 4 years of your life and countless thousands of dollars. Clearly, the consequences are big, as they are when hiring an employee. So how do we do better? Well, simply identify your needs and wants, set up a process, utilize tools to help objectify the decision criteria, and utilize outside resources when possible. Now, obviously there's complexity in each one of these steps, but we must deal with the complexity to ensure our decisions have a greater potential for success. There are plenty of examples of complex and effective selection processes in place that are in front of us consistently. How about the NFL, the NBA, or Major League Baseball drafts? Aren't they selection processes based on defined criteria, needs assessment, outside expertise, and the other concepts that we've discussed in these past weeks? How about colleges reviewing and accepting and rejecting students? How about acceptance in elite military programs such as the Navy SEALs and the Army Rangers, etc.? Aren't they selection processes? And in all cases, the decision process becomes more difficult as the numbers under consideration become smaller and the differences between candidates also become smaller and more subjective. What tools are available to help us negotiate these selection complexities? Well, the tools that we will discuss in this session are far more effective than the assessment methods that we discussed in the last session, but they're also more complex and difficult to manage. But we need that effectiveness regardless of the complexity of the issues. Finally, we have a very important hiring process going on right now in our country. We're electing a president. We are hiring a president, just like we have elected many presidents before. And from those past results, it is clear that sometimes the process is more effective than other times. It is also clear that in the election process, as with other hiring processes we discussed, one critical ingredient must be present. That ingredient is involvement of the stakeholders in the organization. I will make an educated decision based on my needs and my values because I'm a stakeholder in this nation. You also are a stakeholder. If you vote, vote intelligently. Vote with knowledge. You are involved whether you realize it or not, so become consciously involved. This is perhaps the most important selection process of your life. Session 6, External Selection. Okay, now we're getting somewhere. We started out with maybe 300, 400, or 500 applicants, and now we've narrowed it down to 25 or 50 or 100. That's still a big number. And remember, we only have to get down from where we are to 1. Wow, that's a real task. And remember, these remaining candidates meet our basic or minimal qualifications. Essentially, they could most likely do the job. How do we get that number down to 1 is critical on 2 fronts. First and foremost, we want, or should I say we need, to select the best candidates. But secondly, We are making this selection with many eyes on our process, and those eyes are assessing the fairness of our process, the legality of our process, the relevance of our process. In other words, does it relate directly to the job or to the work to be done? The effectiveness of our process, etc. And these eyes, particularly the legal ones, are not necessarily observing our process to help us make improvements. Put another way, there are plenty of people looking for a reason to take legal action regarding how we select employees. So a secondary goal is to protect our organization while making the best possible selection. And I should point out that those two goals are not in conflict. They are complementary, and that's our topic for this session. Of course, one option is to give up and just put all the names in a hat and draw the lucky winner. Some organizations may actually be better off doing that than using the patchwork process that's guiding their current selection. Obviously, there's a better way to select the perfect candidate for us. I was a new HR manager in an organization and was talking to one of the other managers, and our topic was a new opening in his department. I knew he had hired someone into a similar position in the recent past, and I was anxious to establish an orderly hiring process throughout the organization. The manager indicated that he was confident in the process that they had used previously and didn't necessarily see the need for a change. I inquired about that process and was surprised that they were using various tests and assessments to select final candidates. I was even more surprised to find out that the tests were developed within the department and included basic math and other basic mental skills. Some of the assessments were not developed, but found in articles or books. The subject position required almost no math, and the assessment tools bore little relationship to the skills needed to perform the job duties. When questioned, the manager acknowledged this fallacy, but indicated that it was an attempt to find the smartest candidate. Now, I'm not sure that we could have developed a more illegal, unrelated, or useless process if we had tried. After a long discussion, the manager was more than happy to accept a more appropriate process and welcomed the assistance of HR and outside resources. Now, this manager was not trying to put the company in jeopardy. He was not trying to use unfair or inappropriate assessment tools. He was trying to find a way to make the best selection and hiring decision possible. And receiving no direction or assistance from HR, he took action on his own. The lesson is simple. Managers and leaders want help in making hiring decisions and readily accept such help. In the absence of such leadership, managers will devise their own process with the goal of making the best decision. To effect this decision, we first have to realize that the perfect candidate doesn't exist. All candidates have flaws. We must select the candidate with the least harmful flaws. The candidate that possesses the flaws that we can best accept into our organization. Our hope is that the perfect candidate will jump out with clearly defined attributes that are positively related to our job. But this scenario rarely, if ever, happens. Now, I know that once again you're saying, boy, this guy really has a penchant for the obvious. Of course there is no perfect candidate. But you would be surprised how often I've had to remind managers and executives of that simple fact. That's not because they're stupid. It's because they realize how important selecting the right person is to the organization and the future. If you are selecting a box of cereal from the shelf, you can pick the one you think might be the best because the consequences are low. If you need brain surgery and you're selecting a surgeon, great care comes naturally in that selection process. We aren't picking cereal, folks. It's brain surgery. So be prepared to remind your fellow employees that selection is very important, but you are picking the best and not the perfect candidate. I once told a group of executives after much agonizing over finding the perfect person that I was very glad we didn't have this type of selection criteria when each of us was hired, because none of us would ever have been hired. We couldn't even meet our own criteria. That realization brought some reality to the search, and we started looking for the best candidate and not the perfect candidate. Secondly, we have to realize, and I brought this up in an earlier session, that as we narrow the field down, the differences between candidates become smaller and our criteria becomes more subjective and more difficult to measure. And the risk of making the wrong choice and the risk of legal issues becomes greater. Sounds like a perfect storm, doesn't it? So if we can make this subjective criteria more objective, we can reduce but not eliminate our risk. Put another way, if we make our selection now with only the information that we have available to this point in the process we've defined, the decision is probably 80% subjective and 20% objective. What do we have to do to get it to 50-50? And then down to 40-60, and then down to 30%, 70%, and then to 20%, 80%. But we have to understand that we will never get it to 0, 100%. In other words, 0 subjective, 100% objective. But clearly, there is much more we can do to improve our subjective-objective ratio. There is much we can do to change soft or subjective data into hard or objective data. There is much more we can do to reduce the legal risk and increase our certainty of the best decision. What tools are at our disposal to effect this improvement? The text does an excellent job of explaining these tools and pointing out the problems inherent in each and how to overcome some of those problems. And the author's conclusions and advice are right on. I offer one caution, and it's a big one, that I briefly mentioned in an earlier session. Our tendency is to read the material, pick one of the tools, and put it to use. Bad idea. When using these advanced screening techniques, get help. Get professional help. And there is plenty of professional help available. That's advice from someone who has used these and similar tools often and believes in their utility in the selection process. But it's like taking medicine to improve your health. Some can be taken over the counter, like the initial assessment methods we discussed last week. And some are prescription medicines that should be taken under doctor's care. These substantive methods discussed in the text are, for the most part, prescription meds. And because of that, they are among the most effective. I don't diagnose my own medical problems. I don't represent myself legally. I don't do my own work on my car. I don't invest my money without professional help, and I don't make any major decisions without my wife's consult. And I've never used these tools we're discussing without professional assistance. So how might we set up this relationship with outside professionals? Well, there are many options for when professional help can intervene in the process, and I've always chosen to have them available throughout the process, start to finish, but much more involved as we get closer to making the final selection. My preferred arrangement is to engage professional help to develop the process, empower them to offer advice throughout, and more direct involvement in the final decision process. They don't direct the decision. That's up to the hiring manager. But they oversee the fairness, legality, and effectiveness of the decision. They are objective advisors. The professionals I speak of are normally industrial psychologists. They may be operating as private consultants with their own consulting firms, or they may be consulting on a part-time basis and members of the academic community on a full-time basis. Using these resources increases our ability to make the right selection, but also substantially reduces our legal risk. It's not free, but it's a bargain compared to the expense of a poor selection decision or a major lawsuit. I believe I've established that they help, but how specifically do they provide assistance? And perhaps more importantly, why can't you or someone else in your organization perform the same task? Well, first, I mentioned they are advisors, but they are really objective advisors who will help you objectify your selection criteria and decisions. Secondly, I would hope your initial read of the textbook reveals the strengths, flaws, and idiosyncrasies of each of these methods. They are complex and each with useful benefits and substantial issues that must be addressed. I was once told by an organizational psychologist for whom I have immense respect that there are at least 25,000 test, assessment tools, and instruments that can be used to assess traits possessed by individuals. Many of these cannot be administered legally without proper certification, and none of them can be interpreted without guidance and perspective. That's a full-time job, not a part-time interest. Going back to my example in the introduction, I have opinions about the NFL and specific players, but opinions are biased and perhaps short on facts. When it comes to the NFL, I must submit to the experts who spend their entire lives analyzing and understanding the variables inherent in playing the game. Such is the case with assessment tools. And I should point out that these resources don't just help with setting up and interpreting individual assessments, but provide continuity through the entire selection process. They also provide credibility to applicants, the community, and the courts. As a matter of fact, one primary criterion I use to select organizational psychologists or industrial psychologists is their professional credibility. I want to know that if I received a lawsuit, I would have a credible expert in court who would state and be able to prove that our process was unbiased and legal. Just so we are clear and understand how all of this fits together, let's review what a typical hiring process looks like after we have recruited our pool of applicants. We use initial assessment tools to narrow the pool of applicants down and select candidates for our open position. Candidates are subjected to additional assessments and screening assessments, which include phone interviews, background checks such as degree and credential information, reference checks, etc. Structured interviews are conducted with remaining candidates. Substantive assessments are applied to remaining candidates, and additional assessments may be applied to the finalists. Participants in the selection process, interviewers, outside professionals, HR, etc., meet to review finalists, review data, review position criterion, and assist in the decision process. The hiring manager makes the final decision, and the job offer is communicated to the candidate. This is a typical process that I prefer, but by no means is it the only or even the best process. What works for your organization is dependent on your organization, the open position, time available, etc. Obviously, I preferred a different process at Nestle, which I highlighted in session 1. The selection process can be simple or complex, but it must be effective. And effective means that it leads to a decision. The goal is to select a candidate for job offer. The goal is to make a decision. I stated earlier that there is no perfect candidate, and that is absolutely true. I also stated that selection is an imperfect entity. Mistakes will be made, and our goal is to minimize those mistakes. But make no mistake yourself, the process must culminate in a solid, firm decision with no equivocation. I think this candidate will do a good job. I hope this person will do well. We'll give this person a try. Those are the wrong responses. And my following response will typically be, look, before we leave this room and this meeting, we must all agree that we will support this person in this job and make them successful. No one should leave the room and say that the candidate wasn't their choice and will probably fail. Lack of support before the person even assumes the role is likely a guarantee of failure. Do you get the idea that, in my opinion, selection is a team process and not an individual decision? You're right. The final decision rests with the hiring manager, but the selection activities are a team process and require team commitment. The success of the organization is dependent upon the success of the hiring and selection processes. The success of the hiring and selection processes is a function of the skills and expertise of the participants and the quality of the tools they utilize. As in any endeavor, be it medicine, cooking, sports, or rocket science, or your study process, the quality of the tools is dependent on the expertise with which they are applied and their applicability to the task at hand. Garbage in, garbage out. It's really simple when you think about it. All that said, it should be clear that I consider external recruitment and selection extremely important for any organization. But we've left out one other important component: internal recruiting. There's no sense going to the grocery store to buy ingredients to our new exotic dish if we have the ingredients already at home. But first, we have to find the ingredients, make sure they fit the recipe, and they are available. And that's internal recruiting and selection, and that's our next topic.